Eleanor Vance stood in the center of her small-town hardware store, a place that held the scent of sawdust and the quiet dignity of a life well lived. She was 64 years old, with silver hair pulled into a sensible bun and eyes that had seen enough hardship to never be fooled by a hollow promise. For 30 years, this store had been her sanctuary, the place where she honored the memory of a husband taken too soon and where she found peace in the rhythm of small-town life. But on an overcast Tuesday morning, the front door swung open with a violence that shattered the stillness. 3 men, their movements practiced and their intentions cold, marched past the aisles of hammers and nails as if they owned the very floorboards beneath them. They did not come for the tools. They came to strip away the one thing Eleanor had spent decades protecting, reaching for the vintage photograph of her late husband tucked behind the counter, a relic she had kept untouched since the day he was laid to rest. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The leader of the group, a man with a heavy gaze and a jagged scar across his jaw, didn't bother with pleasantries. He shoved a display rack aside, sending metal crashing to the ground with a sound that echoed like a warning bell through the hollow building. He leaned over the counter, his breath smelling of stale tobacco, and informed Eleanor that the town had changed. He claimed that for a fee, his crew would ensure the store remained standing, a thinly veiled threat disguised as a business proposal. Eleanor didn't tremble. She didn't offer the fear he clearly expected to see reflected in her gaze. She simply set down the invoice she had been holding, straightened her apron, and looked him directly in the eyes. She told him that she had survived tragedies that would have broken men half his age, and she had no intention of handing over her dignity to a bully who mistook her silence for weakness. She refused him with a firmness that caused the air in the room to turn frigid. The man's amusement vanished instantly, replaced by a look of genuine confusion that quickly hardened into a cruel resolve. He signaled to his companions, and they began to dismantle the store piece by piece, knocking over shelves and mocking the very items that Eleanor had meticulously maintained for years. They believed that by creating chaos, they would force her to collapse, to hand over the keys and vanish into the anonymity of her own grief. But they were fundamentally mistaken about the woman who stood behind that counter. They looked at her and saw a grandmother, a fragile figure in a worn smock, failing to recognize the iron resolve that had carried her through the darkest years of her life. They didn't know that Eleanor was the daughter of a woman who had taught her how to hold her ground when the world tried to push her out, nor did they know the history of the steel lockbox hidden beneath her desk. As the crew continued their destruction, laughing as they tossed vintage hardware into the dust, Eleanor reached down beneath the counter. Her fingers brushed against the cool metal of a handle she had promised herself she would never touch again. It was a relic from a life she had walked away from 3 decades ago, a life where she had earned the kind of respect that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. She remembered the nights she had spent in the shadows of a different city, navigating a world that rewarded strength and punished the hesitant. She had traded that life for the quiet of this store, choosing to build a legacy on kindness rather than intimidation. Yet, as she watched the man with the scarred jaw pick up a heavy mallet to destroy a shelf her husband had built by hand, she felt the old internal fire ignite. She realized that sometimes, in order to protect the peace you have built, you have to remind those who forget that you were once a force they would have feared. The man turned to her, the mallet swinging loosely in his hand, and asked if she had finally come to her senses. He expected her to plead, to offer him the money she kept in the register, and to beg him to leave her life alone. Eleanor stepped out from behind the counter, moving with a grace that surprised them all. She stood tall, her presence suddenly filling the room in a way that made the men pause their vandalism. She told them that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She spoke with a voice that was low, steady, and devoid of any tremor, a voice that carried the weight of a long-forgotten authority. She invited them to leave immediately, promising that if they turned toward the door right then, they would still have the opportunity to walk out on their own 2 feet. The men shared a look, their bravado flickering as they sensed something in Eleanor that defied their crude expectations of who she was supposed to be. The leader laughed, though the sound lacked its earlier confidence, and he stepped toward her with the intent to shove her aside. Eleanor did not step back. Instead, she leaned into her posture, her eyes locked on his, showing no intention of yielding. As he reached out, she caught his wrist with a strength that belied her age, the movement a precise, practiced redirection of his momentum. Before he could react, she had twisted his arm with a swift, calculated motion, forcing him to his knees as the mallet clattered against the floor. The other two men hesitated, the chaos of the store falling into a sudden, heavy silence. They looked from their leader, who was struggling to find his footing, to Eleanor, who remained standing perfectly still, her hands at her sides, waiting for their next move with the calm patience of someone who had already calculated the outcome of the struggle. This was not a fight born of anger, but of a quiet, unshakable necessity to defend her world. She had spent years cultivating this space, filling it with the memories of her husband and the hard-won peace of her later years. To her, this was not just a store, it was a testament to the fact that one could emerge from the ruins of their own life and build something enduring and good. She had protected this sanctuary with every ounce of her spirit, and she was not about to let a group of men who knew nothing of character or commitment tear it down for a quick profit. The men realized that they were facing an adversary whose resolve was far deeper than anything they had encountered on these streets. They saw in her eyes a history of battles won and lost, a clarity of purpose that made their own petty cruelty seem small and inconsequential. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity, the only sound in the room being the hum of the refrigerator in the back and the labored breathing of the man still kneeling on the concrete. Eleanor did not gloat, nor did she speak further threats. She simply held the space, her posture telling them that if they chose to continue, the consequences would be far more severe than a bruised wrist. The leader managed to scramble up, clutching his arm, and gave his men a subtle nod. The intimidation had failed, and the realization had begun to sink in that they had chosen the wrong target. They backed toward the door, their earlier arrogance replaced by a frantic desire to escape the store and the woman who now stood watch over her domain as if she were the gatekeeper of the very peace they had tried to disrupt. As they fled into the morning light, Eleanor finally let out a long, slow breath. She returned to the counter, her hands shaking only slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. She picked up the photograph of her husband, smoothed the edges of the frame, and placed it back in its rightful spot. She had succeeded in keeping her promise, protecting the life she had worked so hard to build. She knew that the town would talk, and that questions would eventually arise about how a store owner had managed to stand down a group of men so effectively, but she didn't mind. She had reclaimed her territory and reaffirmed the boundaries of her existence. As the sun began to filter through the windows, lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the resilience that had brought her through the trial. She walked to the window and watched the men's vehicle speed away down the main road, their reckless haste a stark contrast to the steady, rhythmic life she chose to lead. She knew they would not return, at least not to her door, and that gave her the clarity she needed to continue. She went back to the workbench, picked up the tool she had set down earlier, and began to repair the damage they had left behind. Each movement was deliberate, a way of stitching her sanctuary back together. She wasn't the same woman she had been before they arrived, but she was still Eleanor Vance, and she was still exactly where she belonged. The store felt quiet again, reclaimed by the routine of the morning, and she found that the peace she had fought for felt even more precious than it had before the ordeal. Her store remained a staple of the community for many years, a place where people knew they could find not just parts and tools, but a sense of stability that was increasingly hard to come by. She never bragged about what happened, and she never sought acknowledgement from the neighbors who had witnessed the men running from her door. She simply continued to show up at 6 in the morning, unlocking the front door to let in the light, and welcoming those who needed a hand with their own projects. She lived with the knowledge that strength is not always found in the loudness of a fight, but in the quiet capacity to endure and to guard what is meaningful. The steel box remained beneath her desk, tucked away from view, a reminder of the life she had left behind and the woman she had chosen to become. As the years passed, the story became a local legend, a tale told in whispers among those who knew the truth of what had transpired that morning. They spoke of the quiet woman who had refused to be intimidated, and how she had stood as a testament to the fact that one's past does not define their future, but it does arm them with the wisdom to handle the present. Eleanor became a pillar of the community, not because of what she had done, but because of how she lived her life in the aftermath. She was a constant, a presence that offered a sense of security to those who knew her. And whenever someone asked her how she had managed to stay so calm in the face of such aggression, she would simply smile, pick up her coffee, and tell them that the most important things in life are always worth standing for.